For a decade, a millionaire erased his own son from his story to preserve his image. His son, left behind after his mother's death, grew up far from the spotlight and far from his father. When the truth came to light, the entire country discovered the secret the millionaire had hidden for years. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Stay with us. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Breno Tenor's penthouse office, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. He adjusted his tailored Italian suit and took a sip of his black coffee, savoring the bitter taste before turning to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. As CEO of Tenor Energy Ventures, one of the continent's leading renewable energy conglomerates, Breno had earned his place among the elite. At 52, his silver-streaked dark hair and chiseled features had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, always with the same confident smile that revealed nothing of what lay beneath. "Mr. Tenor, your 9 o'clock is here," announced his assistant through the intercom. "Send them in," he replied, his deep voice carrying the authority that had become his trademark. The door opened, and a group of executives entered, each carrying leather portfolios. They were here to discuss the latest philanthropic initiative, a $10 million investment in renewable energy education for underserved communities. The irony wasn't lost on Breno. For a decade, he had carefully constructed an image as a corporate humanitarian, while the greatest sin of his life remained buried in the past, hidden away in a farmhouse in rural Vermont. "Gentlemen, ladies," Breno nodded, gesturing toward the conference table. "Let's make this quick. I have a flight to catch this afternoon." As the meeting progressed, Breno's mind drifted momentarily to a place he rarely allowed himself to visit, a weathered farmhouse surrounded by maple trees, a boy with bright blue eyes, his eyes, sitting in a wheelchair on the porch. The memory stabbed at him like a physical pain, and he quickly pushed it away, focusing instead on the presentation before him. "These numbers look good," Breno said, scanning the projections. "But I want more visibility. Get us on prime time. I want every household in the continent to know about this initiative." What every household in the continent didn't know was that Breno Tenor, the self-made billionaire who championed corporate responsibility, had a son he hadn't seen in 10 years, a son whose existence he had methodically erased from public record following the accident that had claimed his wife's life and left the boy paralyzed from the waist down. 2000. Miles away in the rolling hills of Vermont, 16-year-old Ethan stirred from sleep as sunlight warmed his face. His bedroom overlooked acres of apple orchards that had become his sanctuary. He pulled himself up, his strong arms compensating for legs that couldn't carry his weight, and transferred himself into the wheelchair that had been his constant companion since he was 6 years old. "Ethan, breakfast is ready," called Martha from downstairs. The sound of her voice brought a smile to his face. Martha Reeves had been more than the housekeeper for the Tenor family. She had been part of their lives since before Ethan was born. When Breno had walked away after the accident, unable to face his son or the memories of his wife, it was Martha who had stayed. She had taken Ethan to her family's farmhouse, determined to give him the love and stability his father couldn't provide. "Coming," Ethan called back, wheeling himself toward the bathroom. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, sandy brown hair that needed a trim, determined blue eyes, and a face that was beginning to show the definition of early manhood. Sometimes, when he looked at himself, he could see traces of the man whose face occasionally appeared in news segments about business or philanthropy, the man who had decided that a son with a disability didn't fit into his perfect life. By the time Ethan reached the kitchen, Martha had set out a breakfast of pancakes with fresh berries from their garden. At 62, Martha's face was lined with the wisdom of years, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her hands, rough from years of hard work, moved with gentle precision as she poured maple syrup onto his plate. "Got a big day today," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Channel 7 is coming to do that piece on the education program." Ethan nodded, a mixture of excitement and nervousness building in his chest. The Rural Inclusive Education Initiative had started as a simple idea, using technology to connect children in isolated areas who couldn't easily access specialized education. What had begun as a makeshift classroom in their barn had grown into a network connecting dozens of schools across 3 states. Now a national news program wanted to feature their work. "Do you think he'll see it?" Ethan asked quietly, the question hanging between them. It was rare that he spoke directly about his father, but the possibility of national coverage had brought the question to the surface. Martha's eyes softened. "I don't know, honey. But that's not why we're doing this, remember?" Ethan nodded, focusing on his breakfast. "I know, it's about the kids, about making sure nobody gets left behind." "That's right," Martha affirmed, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "And you're doing that beautifully." After breakfast, Ethan wheeled himself out to the barn that had been converted into a tech hub. Solar panels lined the roof, a donation from a local company impressed by Ethan's initiative. Inside, computers hummed alongside adaptive technology devices that Ethan had either built or modified himself. A classroom area was set up with screens where children from remote areas could join virtual classes taught by volunteer teachers. Ethan booted up the systems for the day, checking connections and preparing for the afternoon's coding class. His phone buzzed with a text from James, his best friend and the son of the local high school principal. "News crew just passed my house. Headed your way, don't forget to smile." Ethan grinned, sending back a quick "thanks for the warning" before turning his attention to the final preparations. On the wall hung a framed photo of his mother, Catherine Tenner, her smile radiant as she held a 6-year-old Ethan in her arms. It was the last photo taken before the accident. He touched it briefly as he did every morning, a ritual that connected him to a past he barely remembered. "We're doing good things, Mom," he whispered. "I think you'd be proud." By the time the news van pulled up the gravel driveway, Ethan was ready. He had chosen to wear a simple blue button-down shirt, professional but not pretentious. Martha had insisted on making sure the barn was spotless, though Ethan had reminded her that the authentic working atmosphere was part of what made their project special. The reporter, Alicia Jordan, was a well-known figure in national broadcasting. She approached Ethan with a warm smile and extended her hand. "Ethan Reeves, I'm Alicia Jordan from American Today. Thank you for having us." Ethan shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for coming all the way out here. We're excited to share what we're doing." If Alicia noticed that Ethan used a different last name, Martha's, she didn't mention it. For all official purposes, Ethan had been Martha's ward since he was 6. The legal documents Brano had arranged had effectively transferred guardianship, without revealing the connection between them. It was cleaner that way, Brano had reasoned. A fresh start for everyone. "So tell me how this all started," Alicia said, as the cameraman set up his equipment. Ethan guided his wheelchair toward the classroom area, where screens displayed connections to 5 different rural schools. It began with a simple question. How do we make sure kids with different needs get the education they deserve, even if they live miles from the nearest specialized facility? As Ethan described the program's evolution, his passion was evident. He explained how they had developed low-cost technologies that could be easily implemented in schools with limited resources. He demonstrated the adaptive software he had coded himself, designed to make learning accessible to children with various disabilities. "The most important thing we've learned," Ethan explained, "is that isolation is the enemy of progress. When children can connect, when they can see others like themselves succeeding, it changes their perception of what's possible." As the interview continued, Martha watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. She remembered the frightened little boy who had arrived at the farm, confused about why his father had gone away, why his legs wouldn't work anymore, why everything had changed so suddenly. Now that same boy was articulating a vision that could change thousands of lives. What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, Brano Tenor was settling into a first-class seat on a flight to London, where he would deliver a keynote address at a global energy summit. As the plane took off, he opened his tablet to review his presentation one last time. A presentation that highlighted his company's commitment to building a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. The irony of his words would soon come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. In the production room of American Today's New York headquarters, producer Samantha Winters watched the raw footage from Vermont with growing interest. What had been scheduled as a human interest segment for the Hometown Heroes section was evolving into something more compelling. "Who is this kid?" she asked her assistant, leaning forward to study Ethan's face more closely. "There's something familiar about him." "Ethan Reeves," the assistant replied, consulting his notes. 16 years old. Lives with his guardian, Martha Reeves, who used to work for a wealthy family in New York before moving to Vermont. The program he started has helped over 300 children with special needs in rural communities. Samantha nodded slowly, her journalistic instincts piqued. "Run a facial recognition comparison with the top CEOs in the energy sector," she instructed, "and get me everything you can on Martha Reeves's employment history." As her assistant hurried away, Samantha continued watching the footage. The camera had captured a moment when Ethan wasn't speaking, a brief, unguarded instant when he looked toward the photograph on the wall, his expression a mixture of determination and something deeper. Longing, perhaps. It was the look of someone carrying a story much heavier than the one being told. "This is going to be more than a feel-good piece," Samantha murmured to herself. "Much more." The London Energy Summit bustled with activity as executives, politicians and thought leaders from around the world gathered in the grand ballroom of the Dorchester Hotel. Breno Tenor stood at the center of an admiring circle, champagne flute in hand, effortlessly commanding attention as he discussed the future of sustainable energy. "The key is integration," he was saying, his charismatic presence drawing listeners closer. "We need systems that work together seamlessly, just like communities do." Nearby, Eliza Parker, his director of communications, discreetly checked her phone. Her sharp intake of breath caught Breno's attention, and he excused himself from the group with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his smile in place for the benefit of onlookers. "You need to see this," Eliza whispered, angling her screen toward him. "American Today just released a preview of their Sunday feature. It's going viral. Breno's." Expression remained neutral as he took the phone, but his heart began to race as he saw the thumbnail image. A young man in a wheelchair with familiar blue eyes that mirrored his own, sitting in what appeared to be a converted barn filled with technology. The caption read, "Rural Genius, How Ethan Reeves is Revolutionizing Inclusive Education." For a moment, Breno couldn't breathe. 10 years of careful separation, of meticulously maintained distance, threatened to collapse in an instant. His fingers tightened around the phone as he tapped the play button. The video showed Ethan demonstrating an adaptive device he'd created, explaining with articulate passion how it could help children with motor skill challenges use standard computer equipment. His voice was deeper than Breno remembered, but there was something in his intonation, a certain cadence that was unmistakably familiar. It was Catherine's way of speaking, thoughtful and measured, each word carefully chosen. "Breno." Eliza's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" He handed the phone back to her, his face a mask of composure that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. "Yes, fine. Schedule a call with legal for tomorrow morning, would you? There's something I need to discuss with them." As Eliza stepped away to make the arrangements, Breno excused himself and headed for the restroom. Once alone in a stall, he leaned against the wall, loosening his tie as memories he'd suppressed for years came flooding back. Catherine's laugh as she pushed 6-year-old Ethan on the swing. The boy's delight when Breno had taught him to ride a bicycle. The sterile hospital corridor where he'd paced for hours after the accident, waiting for news. The doctor's solemn face as he explained that Catherine hadn't survived, that Ethan would never walk again. The overwhelming wave of grief and guilt that had made him incapable of being the father his son needed. Breno splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had justified his actions 1,000 times over the years. He wasn't equipped to care for a child with special needs. Ethan would have a better life in a peaceful environment, away from the pressures of Breno's world. Martha would provide the stability and love he couldn't. the substantial trust fund he'd established ensured Ethan would never want for anything. But watching the video, seeing the remarkable young man his son had become despite his absence, Breno was forced to confront the truth he'd been running from. His decision had been about self-preservation, not Ethan's welfare. By the time Breno returned to the gala, his composure was restored, his crisis hidden behind the polished facade he'd perfected. But as he delivered his keynote address about corporate responsibility and creating positive change, each word felt hollow, a performance rather than a truth. Back in Vermont, the day after the interview, Ethan was leading an online coding session with students from 5 different rural schools when Martha entered the barn, her expression serious. "We need to talk when you're done," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, finishing his explanation about algorithm structure before signing off with his usual encouraging words to the students. As the screens went dark, he turned to Martha, concern evident in his eyes. "What's wrong?" "Is it the program?" Martha sat down on a nearby stool, suddenly looking older than her years. "The producer from American Today called. They want to do an expanded feature, not just on the education initiative, but on you, on us." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They're asking questions, Ethan, about your background, about how we came to live here." Martha's hands twisted in her lap. "They found old employment records. They know I worked for the Thompsons." The implications hung in the air between them. For years, they had lived quietly, their past known only to a handful of trusted friends. Ethan had used Martha's last name, becoming Ethan Reeves rather than Ethan Tenner. It wasn't a legal change. Breno had never gone that far, but it was how he was known in their community. "So they know he's my father," Ethan said flatly. Martha nodded. "They're putting the pieces together, and they want to interview you again, this time about your personal story." Ethan wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the apple orchard where he'd spent countless hours learning to navigate his wheelchair over uneven ground, building the upper body strength that now allowed him such independence. This land, this life, had been his salvation, but it had also been a kind of exile. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. Martha moved to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That's not for me to decide, honey. This is your story to tell or keep." Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of robins hop across the yard. "All these years I've wondered if he ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets walking away." "I know," Martha said softly. "The program needs the publicity," Ethan continued, thinking aloud. "The more visibility we get, the more schools we can reach, the more kids we can help." "But this wouldn't just be about the program anymore," Martha cautioned. "Once they connect you to Breno Tenner, everything changes. The media will be relentless. They'll dig into every aspect of what happened after your mother's passing." Ethan turned to face her, his expression resolute. "Maybe it's time. Maybe the truth is part of this journey too." Martha studied him with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The boy she'd raised had grown into a young man of extraordinary character, thoughtful, resilient, and guided by a moral compass that never failed to humble her. But she also knew the pain he carried, the questions that had no satisfying answers. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I'm with you. Always have been, always will be." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I know, that's why I can face whatever comes next." Later that evening, after Martha had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone on the porch, the night air cool against his face. He opened his laptop and did something he had rarely allowed himself to do. He searched for information about his father. The screen filled with images of Breno Tenner, receiving awards, cutting ribbons at charity events, shaking hands with politicians. There was no mention anywhere of a son, no acknowledgement of the life he had left behind. With a deep breath, Ethan closed the laptop and made his decision. He would tell his story, not out of bitterness or revenge, but because it was part of a larger truth about resilience, about finding purpose in pain. because somewhere there might be another child feeling forgotten, and perhaps Ethan's journey could offer them hope. 3 days later, in the offices of Tenor Energy Ventures, Breno sat across from his legal team, his expression grave. "What are our options?" he asked, his voice controlled despite the turmoil he felt. Gregory Simmons, the company's chief counsel, adjusted his glasses. "Legally speaking, we could attempt to block the story on privacy grounds. We could claim the reporter used improper methods to make the connection. But realistically, Mr. Tenor, that would only delay the inevitable and potentially make the situation worse." "The trust fund?" Breno inquired. "Remains confidential," another attorney assured him. "The financial arrangements you made for Ethan are secure and private. However, the fact of his existence and your separation, that's another matter." Breno stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline he had conquered. "What's your advice, Greg? Not as my lawyer, but as someone who's known me for 20 years. Gregory exchanged glances with the other attorneys before responding. "Personally, get ahead of this. Contact your son before the story breaks. Try to make amends if that's possible." Breno's jaw tightened. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Gregory acknowledged, "but it might be necessary. The court of public opinion will be far less forgiving if they believe you're still trying to hide him away." After the lawyers had left, Breno remained at the window, lost in thought. On his desk lay a folder containing everything his team had been able to gather about Ethan's life over the past decade. School records showing exceptional academic performance despite limited resources. Local news clippings about the educational initiative. Medical reports from the specialists Breno had arranged to visit the farm periodically, monitoring Ethan's condition from a distance. Breno had told himself he was protecting Ethan by staying away, that his presence would only complicate the boy's life. But as he reviewed the evidence of all he had missed, the birthdays, the achievements, the challenges, he was forced to confront a more painful truth. He had been protecting himself from having to face his own failures as a father. His phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "American Today confirmed. The expanded feature on Ethan airs Sunday at 8 p.m. They've been trying to reach you for comment." Breno closed his eyes, feeling the carefully constructed walls of his life beginning to crumble. Then, with a decisive motion, he opened his laptop and booked a flight to Vermont. In the farmhouse kitchen, Ethan and Martha sat at the table with James and his father, Principal David Reynolds, discussing the upcoming interview. "They'll try to sensationalize this," David warned, his expression concerned. "They're not just interested in your educational work anymore. They're after a story about the billionaire who abandoned his disabled son." "I know," Ethan acknowledged. "But I'm not going to let them control the narrative. This isn't about vilifying my father. It's about showing what's possible when communities come together." "You're a better person than most would be in your situation," James remarked, his admiration evident. Ethan shrugged. "Being angry wouldn't give me back my legs. It wouldn't change the past. I had to find a different way forward." "That's why your program works," David said, "because it comes from a place of genuine understanding, not theory." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Martha went to the window, her face paling as she recognized the sleek black SUV coming up the driveway. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's him." The room fell silent. Ethan's hands gripped the wheels of his chair, his knuckles white. A decade of questions, of imagined confrontations, suddenly crystallized into a moment he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Do you want us to stay?" David asked, his protective instinct evident. Ethan took a deep breath, centering himself. "No, this is something I need to do alone." He glanced at Martha. "Well, not alone. If you'll stay with me." Martha nodded, moving to stand behind his chair, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. Always. As James and his father quietly excused themselves, slipping out the back door, Ethan positioned his wheelchair facing the front entrance. From outside came the sound of a car door closing, followed by footsteps on the porch steps. Then, after a brief hesitation, a knock. Martha looked down at Ethan, silently asking if he was ready. He gave a small nod, and she walked to the door, opening it to reveal Breno Tenor standing on the threshold, looking both powerful and somehow diminished in his expensive suit, the afternoon sunlight exposing the lines of age and worry on his face. For a long moment, father and son regarded each other across the years of silence that separated them. Then Breno spoke, his voice rougher than Ethan remembered. "Hello, Ethan." Ethan's response was simple, delivered with a calm that belied the emotional storm within him. "You're late." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Ethan's words. Breno stood awkwardly in the doorway, a man accustomed to commanding rooms now uncertain of his welcome in this humble farmhouse that had raised his son. "May I come in?" he finally asked, his voice softer than the confident tone he used in boardrooms. Martha's protective instinct flared, but she looked to Ethan, allowing him to make the decision. With a slight nod, Ethan gestured toward the kitchen table. "We were just having coffee," he said, his composure remarkable for someone facing the man who had walked away from him a decade ago. Breno entered, the expensive leather of his shoes incongruous against the worn wooden floors. As he moved to the table, his eyes took in the details of the home, the patchwork quilt draped over the sofa, the school awards framed on the walls, the modifications made throughout the space to accommodate Ethan's wheelchair. Evidence of a life he had funded but never participated in. "Thank you," Breno said, as Martha reluctantly placed a mug of coffee before him. He didn't touch it, instead focusing on his son. You've grown so much." "That tends to happen." "Over 10 years, Ethan replied, a hint of edge in his otherwise controlled voice. Breno absorbed the subtle rebuke. "I saw the preview for the American Today feature. Your work is impressive." "Why are you here?" Ethan asked directly. "The story doesn't air until Sunday." Breno set his hands on the table, fingers interlaced as if preparing for a negotiation. "I wanted to see you before then, to explain—" "There's nothing to explain," Martha interjected, unable to contain herself any longer. "You made your choice, when Ethan needed you most." "Martha," Ethan said gently, placing his hand over hers. "It's okay." He turned back to Breno. "But she's right. I don't need explanations. I've made my peace with your decision." Breno's composure faltered at the maturity in his son's voice. This wasn't the angry confrontation he had prepared for, the accusations he felt he deserved. Somehow, Ethan's calm acceptance was more disarming. "I'd still like to talk," Breno persisted. "There are things you should know." Ethan studied his father's face, the features so similar to his own yet carved by different experiences. "All right," he conceded, "but not here. I have a class to teach in an hour. You can join me at the barn if you want to talk." Without waiting for a response, Ethan wheeled himself away from the table and toward the door. Breno stood to follow, but Martha stepped into his path. "Listen to me," she said in a low voice, her eyes fierce with a decade of accumulated protectiveness. "That boy has built something beautiful here. If you've come to disrupt that or to ease your conscience at his expense, think again." Breno met her gaze steadily. "I've made many mistakes, Martha. I'm trying not to add to them." "That's the thing about mistakes like yours," she replied coldly. "They don't just disappear because you finally decide to acknowledge them." Outside, the autumn air was crisp as Ethan led the way along the stone path to the converted barn. Breno followed several paces behind, struck by the confident way his son navigated the terrain in his wheelchair, the strength evident in his shoulders and arms. The barn's interior was a stark contrast to its rustic exterior, a state-of-the-art, technological hub with multiple screens, server racks and specialized equipment. Children's artwork adorned one wall, thank you cards from students and parents pinned alongside achievement certificates. "This is impressive," Breno said, genuinely awed by what Ethan had created. Ethan moved to a workbench where components of an unfinished device lay arranged in orderly fashion. "We're designing a new interface for students with limited motor control," he explained, his passion evident as he picked up a prototype. "Current commercial options are too expensive for rural school districts. This will cost less than a fifth of what's on the market." Breno approached, examining the device with interest. The engineering is elegant. Have you considered patents? That would defeat the purpose, Ethan replied. We're making the designs open source. The goal is accessibility, not profit. The gentle rebuke wasn't lost on Breno. Not everything is about money, Ethan. I understand that. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Do you? Your corporate philanthropy suggests otherwise tax deductions wrapped in good PR. Breno accepted the criticism without defense. For a moment they worked in silence, Ethan continuing his assembly while Breno observed. Despite everything, there was something familiar in the way Ethan's fingers moved with precision, the same meticulous attention to detail Breno himself applied to his work. You have her focus, Breno said quietly. Your mother could lose herself in a project for hours. Time would just disappear. Ethan's hands stilled briefly at the mention of his mother, then resumed their work. I don't remember much about her, he admitted, just fragments, her laugh, the smell of her perfume. She adored you, Breno said, his voice rough with emotion. From the moment you were born, you were the center of her world. What about you? Ethan asked, finally looking up from his work. Was I the center of yours too before the accident? The directness of the question hit Breno like a physical blow. Yes, he answered truthfully, but I wasn't as good at showing it as your mother was. I was always working, building the company. I thought I was securing our future. And after, Ethan pressed. After she was gone and I was in this? He gestured to his wheelchair. Breno moved to the window, looking out at the orchard beyond. I fell apart, he admitted. I couldn't handle losing her and seeing you hurt. I told myself you'd be better off with Martha, in a peaceful environment, away from my grief and the pressure of my world. That's what you told yourself, Ethan echoed, his voice steady. But what's the truth? Breno turned back to face his son, the facade of the powerful CEO completely stripped away. The truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't bear to see you in that chair every day, knowing the accident happened because I insisted we take that trip because I was driving. The truth is, I ran away because I couldn't face my own guilt. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Ethan absorbed it, his expression unreadable as he processed his father's words. You know what the worst part was? Ethan finally said. Not the physical therapy or learning to live in this chair. It was wondering what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough for you to stay. Ethan, no, Breno protested, moving closer. It was never about you not being enough. I know that now, Ethan said. But a 6-year-old doesn't understand complex adult emotions. A 6-year-old just knows his dad left and never came back. The truth of this struck Breno with devastating clarity. While he had been consumed by his own pain, his son had been interpreting his absence as rejection. The damage he had inflicted went far deeper than he had allowed himself to recognize. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of students, 5 teenagers from the local high school who assisted with the virtual classes. They paused at the sight of Breno, clearly recognizing him from media coverage. Everyone, this is Mr. Tenor, Ethan said, his tone professional. He's observing today's class. Let's get set up for the session. Breno stepped back, watching as Ethan effortlessly shifted into the role of teacher and mentor. The transformation was remarkable, all traces of their emotional conversation vanishing as Ethan guided his team in preparing for the incoming virtual connections. Within minutes, screens around the barn came alive with faces of children from remote locations, some in wheelchairs like Ethan, others with various physical challenges. Their excitement at seeing Ethan was palpable. Hey everyone, Ethan greeted them warmly. Today we're continuing our programming project. Who remembers where we left off last time? A young girl with cerebral palsy used an eye-tracking device to respond. We were learning about loops, she said, her synthesized voice clear through the speakers. That's right, Emma, Ethan confirmed. And today we're going to see how loops can help us create some really cool animations. As the class progressed, Breno observed from a corner, increasingly amazed by his son's teaching abilities. Ethan broke down complex concepts into accessible pieces, adapting his explanations for different learning styles and abilities. His patience was infinite, his encouragement genuine. When a student struggled, he found alternative ways to explain, never leaving anyone behind. This, Breno realized, was what real leadership looked like, not the power plays and strategic maneuvers of corporate the continent, but the authentic connection that lifted others up, that saw potential where others saw limitations. By the end of the class, the students had created simple animations that moved across their screens, their pride evident in their smiles and exclamations. Ethan praised each one specifically, highlighting their progress and setting challenges for their next session. As the screens went dark and the team began shutting down the systems, one of the local students approached Breno. "Are you really Ethan's dad?" the boy asked, his expression curious rather than judgmental. Before Breno could respond, another voice answered from the doorway. "He is." Dr. Michael Foster stood there, a messenger bag slung over his shoulder. In his early 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he had an air of quiet authority. Though that's a title that needs to be earned, not just bestowed by biology. Ethan's face lit up at the sight of the man. "Dr. Foster, I didn't know you were coming today. Thought I'd stop by to see how the new interface is coming along," Dr. Foster replied, entering the barn and placing a warm hand on Ethan's shoulder. A gesture of both affection and respect. "Also wanted to make sure your prepare Saturday morning dawned, with a clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the Vermont landscape." Ethan woke early, as was his habit, transferring himself from bed to wheelchair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted the rhythm of his altered life. Through his window, he could see mist rising from the orchard, the autumn leaves glowing like embers in the early light. His mind kept returning to yesterday's encounter with his father, the strange sensation of sitting across from the man whose features he saw in his own reflection, whose absence had shaped his life in ways both painful and profound. He had imagined that moment so many times over the years, rehearsed words of anger, of accusation, of painfully simple questions that deserved answers. Yet when the moment had finally arrived, he had found himself oddly calm, more curious than furious. Downstairs, he found Martha already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough with the vigor that characterized her approach to life's challenges. Her silver hair was tied back, flour dusting her forearms as she worked the dough with practiced hands. "You're stress baking," Ethan observed, wheeling himself to the coffee maker. Martha didn't deny it. "Apple cinnamon. Thought we could use something sweet today." Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee, inhaling the rich aroma. "I'm meeting him again this afternoon." Martha's kneading paused momentarily before resuming. "Are you sure that's what you want?" "I'm not sure of anything right now," Ethan admitted. "But I think I need to hear him out, for my own sake, not his." Martha nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had always respected Ethan's judgment, even when it differed from what she might have chosen for him. It was one of the many ways she had helped him grow into his own person, rather than a reflection of her expectations. "Michael called earlier," she said, changing the subject. "He's coming over to check your chair before the interview tomorrow. Said something about the left brake needing adjustment." Ethan smiled. "He worries too much." "He cares," Martha corrected gently. "That's never a bad thing." After breakfast, Ethan spent the morning in the barn working on refining the interfaces for his educational program. The American Today team was scheduled to arrive early the next day for final setup before the live segment. The thought of millions of viewers watching as his personal history was exposed was daunting, but Ethan was determined to keep the focus on the work, on the children who benefited from the Inclusive Education Initiative. At noon, his concentration was broken by the sound of tires on gravel. Looking up, he expected to see Dr. Foster's familiar sedan, but instead saw a sleek town car he didn't recognize. The door opened, and a woman in a tailored suit emerged, her purposeful stride indicating someone accustomed to navigating professional environments. Ethan wheeled himself to the barn entrance, curious but wary. "Ethan Reeves?" the woman asked, extending her hand. "I'm Eliza Parker, Director of Communications for Tenor Energy Ventures." Ethan shook her hand, his expression neutral. "You work for my father." "I do," she confirmed, her professional smile never wavering. "He asked me to drop off some information he thought might interest you. May I?" Ethan gestured for her to enter the barn. Eliza looked around, clearly impressed by the technical setup, but careful not to show too much reaction. "This is quite an operation," she commented, placing a leather portfolio on a clear space at Ethan's workbench. "What is this?" Ethan asked, eyeing the portfolio. "Your father wanted you to have this before your meeting this afternoon," Eliza explained. "It contains information about the funding arrangements he's prepared for your education initiative. He believes in what you're doing and wants to support its expansion." Ethan made no move to open the portfolio. "I didn't ask for his money." Eliza's professional demeanor softened slightly. "If I may speak candidly, Ethan, in the 10 years I've worked for Braino Tenor, I've never seen him as affected by anything as he was after seeing you yesterday. Whatever his motivations, I believe they're genuine." "His motivations have never been my concern," Ethan replied evenly. "His actions are what matter." Eliza nodded, accepting the implied criticism. "I'll leave this with you to review before your meeting. Mr. Tenor will be at the town gazebo at 3 as arranged." After she departed, Ethan stared at the portfolio for several minutes before finally opening it. Inside were detailed financial projections, expansion plans, and legal frameworks for establishing the Rural Inclusive Education Initiative as a nationally recognized non-profit organization with substantial backing. The documents were thorough, professionally prepared, and clearly represented significant resources. But what caught Ethan's attention was a handwritten note on Tenor Energy. Letterhead: "Ethan, these resources come with no strings attached. Whether or not you want me in your life, your work deserves support. I've instructed legal to structure this so that you have complete control. This isn't about buying forgiveness. It's about making sure your vision can reach every child who needs it." Braino. Ethan closed the portfolio, conflicting emotions churning within him. The offer was generous, the potential impact undeniable. With this level of funding, the program could expand nationally, reaching thousands more children. But accepting felt uncomfortably close to absolving his father of a decade of absence. In the town's central park, Braino sat on a bench near the gazebo, watching local families enjoy the crisp autumn day. Children played on the nearby equipment, their laughter carrying on the breeze. A painful thought struck him. He had never taken Ethan to a park like this after the accident. In his mind, the wheelchair had become a barrier to such simple pleasures, a failure of imagination and empathy that now seemed inexcusable. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Gregory Simmons. "Braino, we have a situation. American Today isn't just doing a feature on Ethan and his education work. They're digging into the accident investigation, specifically the safety restraint issue." Braino's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" "Our media monitoring team flagged unusual archive requests. Someone's been pulling the old investigation files, interviewing former employees from Tenor SunGuard. The producer, Samantha Winters, has a reputation for investigative pieces, not just human interest." Braino closed his eyes, the implications washing over him. "What are they looking for specifically?" "The connection between your family tragedy and the product liability questions that were never fully resolved," Gregory replied grimly. "The fact that the investigation was closed abruptly after SunGuard was quietly sold off to a foreign subsidiary." "That was standard corporate restructuring," Braino defended, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You and I know that," Gregory said, "but packaged the right way, it looks like you used corporate power to bury an investigation that implicated your own company in the accident, that paralyzed your son and took your wife's life." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Ethan's wheelchair along the park path. "I need to go," Braino said quickly. "Prepare a complete briefing on what they have and what they're likely to focus on. And Gregory, this needs to be handled differently than our usual crisis management." As he put away his phone, Braino stood to greet his son. Ethan's expression was unreadable as he approached, the leather portfolio visible in his lap. "I see Eliza found you," Braino observed, trying to gauge Ethan's reaction. "She did," Ethan confirmed, stopping his chair a few feet away. "That's quite an offer you've put together. Brino sat back down on the bench, bringing himself closer to eye level with his son. It's not an offer. It's a commitment, regardless of how things proceed between us personally. Ethan studied him skeptically. And the timing? Just as this story is about to break nationally, that's a coincidence? No, Brino admitted. Not a coincidence, but not what you're thinking either. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Seeing you on that video preview forced me to confront what I've been running from for 10 years. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. Ethan wheeled himself to position his chair beside the bench, both of them now facing the playground. For a moment they sat in silence, watching the children play. I have questions, Ethan finally said, things I've wondered about for years. Ask. Me anything, Brino offered, prepared for the worst. Ethan turned to face him directly. The accident, Mom's passing, my injury, I never got the full story. Brino hadn't expected to start here, with the most painful memory of his life, but he owed Ethan the truth, however difficult. We were driving back from the lake house. He began, his voice low. It was raining. Catherine was tired, so I was behind the wheel. You were in your booster seat behind her. He paused, gathering himself. A truck ahead of us jackknifed. I swerved to avoid it, but we hit the guardrail instead. The car rolled. Ethan listened intently, filling in gaps in his fragmented childhood memories. And Mom? Brino's composure faltered. The impact was on the passenger side. She was gone before the emergency services arrived. He couldn't bring himself to use more explicit terms, even now. You were unconscious when they cut you. Out of the car. The doctors weren't sure if you'd wake up. But I did, Ethan said quietly. You did, Brino confirmed. 3 days later, when they told me about your spine, about the paralysis, he trailed off, the memory still vivid. I fell apart, Ethan. I couldn't handle it, couldn't face what had happened, what it meant for you. So you left, Ethan concluded, no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. Not immediately, Brino clarified. I tried at first, but every time I looked at you in that hospital bed, all I could see was what I'd taken from you, your mother, your ability to walk, your normal childhood. You didn't cause the accident, Ethan pointed out. Brino hesitated, the conversation with Gregory still fresh in his mind. There's more to it than that, he admitted. Something I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else. Ethan's expression grew cautious. What do you mean? Before Brino could continue, a voice called out from across the park. Ethan! There you are! They both turned to see James approaching, his expression anxious. He slowed as he noticed Brino, recognition dawning on his face. Sorry to interrupt, James said, looking uncomfortably between them. But Ethan, you need to see this. It just went online. He held out his phone, opened to the American Today website. The preview headline read, Breaking, Corporate Cover-Up Behind Tenor Family Tragedy. Exclusive investigation reveals potential link between energy mogul's company and the accident that claimed his wife's life and paralyzed his son. Breno's heart sank as he saw the color drain from Ethan's face. This was exactly what he had feared. A story breaking before he had a chance to explain. What is this? Ethan demanded, looking up from the phone to his father. Breno struggled to find the right words. It's complicated, Ethan. The accident investigation raised questions about the safety restraint system in our car, a system manufactured by a company that was, at the time, owned by Tenor Energy. Ethan's expression hardened as understanding dawned. Your company made the defective parts that caused the accident? No, that was never proven, Breno insisted. The investigation was inconclusive. Because you shut it down, James interjected, unable to contain himself. That's what the article says. That you used your corporate influence to halt the investigation and then sold off the subsidiary to make the problem disappear. Brino shot James a warning look before turning back to Ethan. That's not how it happened. Yes, the investigation ended without a definitive conclusion, and yes, we divested from SunGuard afterward, But those were separate business decisions. Business decisions, Ethan repeated, the words like acid on his tongue. Is that what we were to you, my mother and I? Business decisions? Ethan, please, Brino implored. Let me explain. Explain what? Ethan cut him off, his composure finally cracking. That you not only abandoned me after the accident, but might have been responsible for it in the first place. That you covered it up to protect your company's reputation. Brino reached out, but Ethan backed his wheelchair away. I never knew for certain if the restraint system was at fault, he insisted. The preliminary findings suggested it might have contributed to the severity of the injuries, but nothing was conclusive. And you didn't think I deserved to know that? Ethan demanded, his voice rising. That there might have been more to the story than just bad luck? That your company might have been partially responsible for what happened to Mom, to me? Breno had no answer that could mitigate the betrayal Ethan was feeling. The truth was, he had compartmentalized the accident investigation, delegating it to his legal team while he spiraled through grief and guilt. By the time he had emerged from that fog, decisions had been made, actions taken, all under his authority, but without his direct involvement. I should have told you, he acknowledged, his voice heavy. I should have been honest with you about everything. I have no excuse. Ethan stared at him, years of suppressed anger finally surfacing. Do you know what I've been doing all these years while you were hiding from the truth? I've been living it every day. I wake up in this chair and face the reality of what happened. I didn't have the luxury of running away. The accusation hit Breno with the force of physical blow. Before he could respond, Martha's pickup truck pulled up to the park entrance, Dr. Foster in the passenger seat. They had clearly seen the same article. Ethan, Martha called, her voice tense with concern. Come on, honey, let's go home. Ethan hesitated, looking between his father and the woman who had raised him. The conflict was visible on his face, the need for answers warring with the desire to retreat from this new pain. We're not done, he told Breno, his voice low and controlled, despite his evident distress, but I need time to process this. Breno nodded, understanding. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. As Ethan wheeled himself toward Martha's truck, Dr. Foster approached Breno, his expression somber. I warned you, Foster said quietly. I told you not to hurt him again. This isn't what I wanted, Breno replied, watching, as James helped load Ethan's wheelchair into the truck. I came here to make things right. But did you come to tell the truth? Foster challenged. Or just the parts that make you look better? Before Breno could answer, Foster turned away, joining Martha and Ethan in the truck. Breno stood alone in the park, watching as they drove away, taking his son with them. His phone buzzed incessantly. In his pocket, no doubt crisis managers, lawyers and PR specialists all clamoring for his attention as the story began to spread. But for once, Breno Tenor, the man who controlled a corporate empire, felt utterly powerless. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan sat in stunned silence at the kitchen table, struggling to process the revelations of the afternoon. Martha moved around him with quiet efficiency, making tea, her presence a steady anchor in the midst of emotional turbulence. Dr. Foster sat across from him, his expression concerned. How are you holding up? I don't know, Ethan admitted. It's too much to take in all at once. Martha placed a mug of tea before him, her hand lingering on his shoulder. You don't have to do the interview tomorrow. No one would blame you for wanting privacy right now. The interview isn't about him, Ethan said firmly. It's about the program, about the kids we're helping. But they'll ask, Foster pointed, out gently. Now that this story is broken, they'll want your reaction. Ethan stared into his tea, thinking about the children who connected to his virtual classroom each day, children who faced their own challenges with courage he had come to admire deeply. Then I'll give them one, but on my terms, not theirs. Knock at the door interrupted them. Martha went to answer, returning moments later with a troubled expression. Ethan, there's someone here to see you, a producer from American Today. Samantha Winters stood in the doorway, her professional demeanor slightly at odds with the rustic setting of the farmhouse kitchen. I apologize for the intrusion, she said, addressing Ethan directly. But given the developments today, I thought we should talk before tomorrow's interview. Ethan studied her warily. The article went up without warning. Was that ethical journalism? Samantha had the grace to look somewhat abashed. That wasn't my decision. Our news division moved forward once they verified key elements of the investigation. I would have preferred to wait until after our scheduled interview. What do you want? Foster asked, his protective instinct evident. To give Ethan the opportunity to tell his side of the story, Samantha replied. To control his own narrative rather than have it controlled by others. Ethan considered this, weighing his options. The story was already out there, spiraling beyond his control. Perhaps this was his chance to reclaim some agency in a situation where he had previously had none. Tomorrow's interview, he said finally. Will you guarantee that the focus remains on the education initiative? That's what matters most to me. I can't promise that the personal aspects won't be addressed, Samantha answered honestly, but I can promise that your educational work will be central to the segment, and that you'll have the opportunity to direct the conversation where you want it to go. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we proceed as planned. After Samantha left, promising to return with her crew in the morning, an uneasy silence fell over the kitchen. Martha and Dr. Foster exchanged worried glances, their concern for Ethan palpable. Are you sure about this? Martha asked. Once you go on national television, there's no taking it back. Ethan wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the land that had become his sanctuary and his purpose. For 10 years I've lived with unanswered questions, with a narrative I didn't choose. Tomorrow I get to tell my own story. As evening settled over the farm, Ethan retreated to his room, needing space to prepare himself for what was to come. On his desk sat the portfolio his father had delivered, the plans, the funding, the promise of taking his work to a national scale. Beside it lay his mother's photograph, her smile a frozen moment from a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. Tomorrow would change everything. The private pain he had carried would become public knowledge. The work he had, built in quiet determination, would be thrust into the spotlight, and the father who had walked away would be forced to face the consequences of his actions, not just privately, but in the court of public opinion. Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready. But he was certain of one thing. This time he would be the one making the choices. Sunday morning arrived with a flurry of activity at the farmhouse. The American Today production crew had transformed the barn into a makeshift studio with lighting rigs, multiple cameras, and sound equipment carefully positioned to capture both Ethan and the educational technology that had become his life's work. Outside, satellite trucks lined the normally quiet driveway, a tangible reminder of how much had changed in just a few days. In his room, Ethan dressed with deliberate care, a navy button-down shirt, pressed khakis, and the custom-made leather, shoes that Dr. Foster had given him for his 16th birthday. Appearance matters, Foster had told him, not because of what others think, but because of how it makes you feel about yourself. Today, Ethan needed every ounce of confidence he could muster. A soft knock at his door preceded Martha's entrance. She carried a small wooden box, her expression a mixture of pride and apprehension. "I've been saving this," she said, opening the box to reveal a silver tie clip. "It was your grandfather's, your mother's father. She gave it to me for safekeeping. Before the accident. She wanted you to have it when you were old enough." Ethan took the tie clip, running his finger over the initials engraved on its surface. C.T. Catherine Tenner. The unexpected connection to his mother brought a lump to his throat. "Thank you," he managed, clipping it to his tie, "for keeping this, for keeping all the pieces of my past that would have been lost otherwise." Martha smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You look so much like her sometimes. She'd be so proud of the man you've become." They were interrupted by James, who poked his head in the door. "They're ready for you downstairs. Alicia Jordan just arrived." Ethan took a deep breath, centering himself. "Let's do this." Downstairs, the scene was controlled chaos. Production assistants moved efficiently around the space, checking light levels and sound quality. In the center of it all stood Alicia, Jordan, the veteran journalist whose reputation for compassionate but unflinching interviews had made her a household name. "Ethan," she greeted him warmly, extending her hand. "Thank you for going forward with this. I know the circumstances have become more complicated than any of us anticipated." Ethan shook her hand firmly. "The work hasn't changed. That's what matters." Behind Alicia, Ethan spotted Samantha Winters in conversation with the director, no doubt finalizing the approach for the segment. Nearby, Dr. Foster stood watchfully, his presence a silent guarantee that Ethan's well-being would remain a priority, regardless of the direction the interview took. "Has my father been in contact?" Ethan asked Martha quietly as they moved toward the set. Martha shook her head. "Not since yesterday. His assistant called to confirm that the interview was still happening, but that's all." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. Breno Tenor was a strategic thinker. He would be assessing his options, consulting with advisors, planning his next move. Whether that move would prioritize damage control or genuine reconciliation remained to be seen. As Ethan took his position on the set, adjusting his wheelchair to the marked spot, Alicia settled into the chair opposite him. Behind the cameras, the production team fell silent, all attention focused on the upcoming exchange. "We'll start with your educational initiative," Alicia explained, "then move naturally into your personal journey. If at any point you need a break, just let me know. This isn't a confrontation, Ethan. It's your story to tell." "I appreciate that," Ethan replied, touched by her sensitivity, despite the obviously sensational aspects of the story. A production assistant counted down, and suddenly the red lights on the cameras illuminated, signaling they were recording. Alicia's professional demeanor subtly shifted, her posture straightening as she addressed the viewers who would soon be watching across the continent. "Good morning. I'm Alicia Jordan, coming to you live from Vermont, where a remarkable story of innovation, resilience, and unanswered questions has been unfolding. Today we're speaking with Ethan Reeves, the 16-year-old founder of the Rural Inclusive Education Initiative, a groundbreaking program that's changing how children with special needs access education in the continent's most isolated communities." The camera panned to include Ethan, who maintained the composed presence he had practiced for years when speaking about his work. "Ethan, for viewers just learning about your program, explain how it began and what makes it unique." With this familiar opening, Ethan felt himself relax slightly. This was the conversation he had prepared for, the work he was proud to discuss. "It started with a simple observation," he began. "Children with disabilities in rural areas often face a double barrier, their physical challenges and their geographic isolation. Traditional solutions require either expensive specialized equipment or long commutes to centralized facilities. Neither works well for families with limited resources." As Ethan described the program's evolution, demonstrating the adaptive technologies he had developed, the interview flowed naturally. Alicia asked insightful questions about accessibility, about the challenges of rural education, about the children whose lives had been changed by the initiative. Then, with a subtle shift in tone, she moved to the more personal aspects. "Ethan, your work comes from a deeply personal place. You yourself have navigated life with a disability since you were 6 years old. Can you tell our viewers about that journey?" Ethan had anticipated this transition. "When I was 6, I was involved in a car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. My mother didn't survive the accident. Those events fundamentally changed the course of my life. And you came to live here on this farm with Martha Reeves," Alicia continued gently. Ethan glanced toward Martha, who stood watching from behind the cameras, her encouraging nod giving him strength. "Martha had been part of our household, staff in New York. After the accident, she became my guardian and brought me here to Vermont. She's the reason I am who I am today." Alicia leaned forward slightly. "Yesterday, a story broke about the connection between your accident and Tenor Energy Ventures. For many of our viewers, this was the first revelation that you are in fact the son of Breno Tenor, one of the continent's most prominent business leaders." The camera operators adjusted their focus, capturing Ethan's reaction to this direct acknowledgement of the relationship that had been hidden for so long. "Yes, Ethan confirmed, his voice steady. Braino Tenor is my biological father. And yet for 10 years you've lived here with Martha, using her last name, effectively separated from your father and his world. Can you help our viewers understand why? This was the moment Ethan had prepared. For the question that cut to the heart of his story, he took a moment gathering his thoughts, conscious of the millions who would hear his answer. After my mother's passing and my injury, my father found himself unable to cope with the reality of our new circumstances. He made a decision to place me in Martha's care, believing it would provide me with a more stable environment than he could offer. Was that decision mutual? Alicia probed. I was 6 years old, Ethan replied simply. I didn't understand what was happening, only that my mother was gone and my father wasn't coming back. The rawness of this truth hung in the air between them. Behind the cameras, Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. The report that emerged yesterday suggests that there may have been another factor in your father's decision, Alicia continued carefully. It indicates that the vehicle safety system involved in your accident was manufactured by a subsidiary of your father's company. Were you aware of this connection? No, Ethan admitted, the pain of this recent revelation still fresh. I learned about that possibility only yesterday when the story broke. How did that make you feel? Ethan paused, considering his words carefully. He could see Samantha Winters watching intently from the side, clearly aware that this moment would likely define the segment's impact. Confused, he finally answered. Hurt, but mostly I felt a renewed sense of loss for the relationship that might have been, for the conversations that never happened. Alicia nodded sympathetically before shifting direction. Ethan, despite these challenging circumstances, you've built something extraordinary here. What drove you to create the Rural Inclusive Education Initiative? This question brought Ethan back to more comfortable ground. When I first came to Vermont, I struggled with isolation. Rural areas aren't always equipped for people with disabilities. But I was fortunate. Martha advocated for me, Dr. Foster. Provided medical care and mentorship, and the community embraced us. I realized that not every child in my situation has that support system. I wanted to create one. And that's exactly what you've done, Alicia affirmed, gesturing toward the technology surrounding them. Your program now connects hundreds of students across multiple states. Before Ethan could respond, there was a commotion at the barn entrance. The production team turned, and Martha stepped forward protectively as Braino Tenor appeared in the doorway. He was alone, without the entourage of advisors and handlers that typically surrounded him. I apologize for the interruption, Braino said, addressing Alicia before turning his gaze to Ethan. But there are some things that need to be said, and they need to be said now. A tense silence fell over the barn as all eyes moved between Braino and Ethan. Samantha quickly conferred with Alicia, who then turned to Ethan. It's your decision, Alicia told him, quietly. We can stop the recording or we can continue, whatever you want. Ethan studied his father, the man who had walked away 10 years ago, now standing before him, asking to be heard. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. Let him speak. Braino approached slowly, aware of the cameras tracking his movement, but focused entirely on his son. Thank you, he said, his voice lacking its usual commanding presence. Alicia, Eva, the professional, adapted quickly to this unexpected development. Mr. Tenor, you've chosen to join us during this live interview. Would you like to address the reports that emerged yesterday regarding your company's connection to the accident that injured your son? Braino straightened, facing the cameras directly. Yes, I would, but first I need to address my son. He turned to Ethan, the practiced polish of the corporate titan falling away, to reveal a man confronting the greatest regret of his life. Ethan, I've spent 10 years hiding from the truth, not just from the world, but from myself. After your mother died and you were injured, I convinced myself that I was protecting you by staying away. The reality is, I was protecting myself from facing my own failures. The barn was utterly silent as Braino continued, seeming to forget. The cameras and crew speaking only to his son. The accident that took your mother and changed your life has haunted me every day. When questions were raised about the safety system in our vehicle, I didn't want to believe it could be true. I delegated the investigation to others, buried myself in work, and eventually convinced myself that the connection was inconclusive. Breno took a breath, visibly struggling with his emotions. But the truth is, I knew there was a possibility, a real possibility, that a product from my own company had contributed to the tragedy. And instead of facing that, instead of ensuring that every question was answered, I allowed the investigation to be closed prematurely. I allowed the subsidiary to be sold off. I told myself it was just business, but it wasn't. It was cowardice. For the first time in the interview, Ethan's composure wavered, the weight of this confession hitting him with full force. "Why are you saying this now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because I've spent a decade pretending to be a leader, while running from the most important responsibility in my life, being your father," Breno replied. "Because seeing the man you've become despite me, not because of me, has forced me to confront what I threw away. And because if there's even the smallest chance that you might someday forgive me, I have to start with the truth." The raw honesty of the moment transcended the calculated nature of televised interviews. Alicia remained silent, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. "I can't undo the past 10 years, Breno continued. "I can't give you back your childhood or the relationship we should have had, but I can ensure that the truth about the accident is finally investigated properly, no matter where that leads. I can make sure that the work you've built here reaches every child who needs it. And I can spend whatever time you'll allow me trying to earn a place in your life, not as the man on the magazine covers, but as someone who regrets his worst decision and wants to do better." Ethan sat motionless, processing his father's words. The years of questions, of imagined confrontations, had not prepared him for this moment of raw vulnerability from a man who had built his reputation on strength and control. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ethan finally said, his honesty matching his father's. "Not yet, maybe not ever completely. But I do know that holding on to anger won't change the past. It will just darken the future." Breno nodded, accepting this reality. "That's more than I deserve." Alicia, sensing the importance of what was unfolding, gently steered the conversation back to the broader implications. "Mr. Tenner, you mentioned ensuring that the truth about the accident is properly investigated. Are you prepared to open your company to that scrutiny, regardless of the potential consequences?" Breno turned to the camera. "Yes, I've already instructed our legal team to cooperate fully with an independent investigation. Whatever we find, whatever my role or my company's role might have been, will be made public no matter the cost." "And the education initiative?" Alicia prompted, gesturing to the technology surrounding them. "That's Ethan's creation," Breno replied. "Its future should be his decision, not mine. I've offered resources to help expand the program nationally, but with no strings attached. Whether he accepts that offer is entirely up to him." As the interview continued, delving into the details of what this new investigation might reveal and how the education initiative might evolve, Martha watched with mixed emotions. The protective anger she had carried for 10 years warred with cautious hope that perhaps somehow this painful history might find resolution, if not redemption. Dr. Foster moved to stand beside her, his expression similarly conflicted. "So you think he means it?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Breno. Martha considered the question. "I think he wants to," she replied. "Whether he's capable of following through, that remains to be seen." After the cameras stopped rolling and the production team began dismantling their equipment, Ethan found himself facing his father in a rare moment without an audience. Breno seemed smaller somehow, stripped of the power dynamics that had defined their brief interactions thus far. "What happens now?" Breno asked, the uncertainty in his voice revealing how far he was from his comfort zone. Ethan looked toward the window, where students from his program had begun to gather, drawn by news of the interview. Among them were children in wheelchairs. Similar to his own children whose lives had been changed by the technologies and connections he had created. "Now," Ethan said thoughtfully, "we see if actions match words. The program needs to grow. Those kids need what we've built here. But it has to happen the right way, on the right terms." Your terms, Brino acknowledged. Yes, Ethan confirmed, and the first term is honesty. Complete honesty about everything, moving forward. Brino nodded. I can do that. For the first time, a faint smile crossed Ethan's face. We'll see. 6 months later, the barn at Martha's farm had been transformed. What had once been a makeshift technology hub was now the headquarters of the National Inclusive Education Foundation, complete with state-of-the-art equipment, a dedicated staff and connections to schools in all 50 states. The rustic charm remained, but the capacity had expanded exponentially. The independent investigation into the accident had been completed, confirming what Brino had feared. The safety restraint system in their vehicle had indeed been defective, a fact that had been identified in preliminary testing, but not addressed due to cost considerations. The findings had led to a complete overhaul of safety protocols across Tenor Energy Ventures and a substantial settlement with families affected by similar issues, though no amount of money could ever compensate for what had been lost. Brino had kept his word about transparency, facing the media storm that followed without evasion. The corporate consequences had been significant. Stock prices had fallen, board members had resigned, and competitors had seized the opportunity to capitalize on the scandal. But Tenor Energy had survived, emerging with a renewed commitment to ethical practices and genuine corporate responsibility. As for Brino and Ethan's relationship, it remained a work in progress. Brino had purchased a small house in the nearby town, making regular visits to the farm, but respecting the boundaries Ethan had established. He attended Ethan's virtual classes sometimes, learning alongside the students about the technologies his son had developed. It was a humble role for a man accustomed to leadership, but one he embraced with unexpected grace. On this particular day, as autumn once again painted the Vermont countryside in brilliant colors, Ethan sat on the porch, watching as a group of children from the local community engaged in an adaptive sports program in the field beside the barn. Among them was Dr. Foster, demonstrating wheelchair basketball techniques with infectious enthusiasm. Martha emerged from the house carrying 2 mugs of hot cider. She settled into the chair beside Ethan, following his gaze to the activity below. "They're getting better," she observed. "Especially Lily, she's got a natural talent." Ethan nodded in agreement. "She reminds me of myself at that age, determined to prove she can do anything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun warm on their faces despite the cool air. "Your father called," Martha said finally. "The foundation board approved the expansion into the western states. The funding will be available next month." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. Brino had proven reliable in his commitments, whatever his other flaws might be. "He also asked if you'd consider speaking at the Education Summit in Washington," Martha continued, "alongside him." This was newer territory, a public acknowledgement of their relationship, of the complicated history they shared. Ethan considered the request thoughtfully. "What do you think?" he asked Martha, valuing the wisdom that had guided him for so long. Martha took a sip of her cider before answering. "I think," she said carefully, "that you've never let fear of difficulty stop you from doing what matters, whether it's building this program or rebuilding a relationship." Below them, a car pulled into the driveway, Brino's modest sedan, a deliberate departure from the luxury vehicles that had once defined his image. As he emerged from the car, Ethan noticed that he carried a folder similar to those he brought each week, containing ideas and resources for the Foundation's work. But today, there was something else as well, a small package wrapped in simple blue paper. "I should go down," Ethan said, setting aside his mug. He mentioned wanting to discuss the curriculum for the new online classes. Martha smiled knowingly. "Take your time. I'll keep an eye on the basketball stars." As Ethan wheeled himself down the ramp that connected the porch to the pathway, he reflected on the journey of the past year. The national spotlight had eventually moved on to other stories, as it always did. The scandal had faded from headlines, though not from memory. What remained was the daily work of building something meaningful, both the educational program that had become his life's purpose and the tentative relationship with the father who had returned too late. but perhaps not entirely in vain. There were still difficult days, still moments when the weight of the past threatened to overshadow the possibilities of the future. But Ethan had long ago learned what his students were now discovering, that the true measure of resilience isn't the absence of obstacles, but the determination to navigate them, one difficult turn at a time. As his father approached, Ethan could see in his eyes the same recognition that some journeys, no matter how delayed in starting, are still worth taking. "I brought something for you," Brino said, holding out the small package. "Something I should have given you years ago." Ethan accepted it with curious hands, unwrapping the paper to reveal a worn, leather-bound journal. Opening it, he recognized his mother's handwriting filling the pages. "She kept journals," Brino explained. "This one was from the year before the accident. She wrote about you constantly, your first day of kindergarten, the time you built that elaborate fort in the living room, how you insisted on helping her garden by planting cookies to grow a cookie tree." Ethan ran his fingers over the pages. These precious fragments of a mother he had barely known, now restored to him. It wasn't everything he had lost, but it was something real, something tangible from the past he had been denied. "Thank you," he said simply, the words insufficient for the gift he had been given. As they moved toward the barn to continue their foundation work, Ethan thought about the children playing basketball with Dr. Foster, about the students connecting to his virtual classrooms from across the country, about the countless lives being shaped by choices made now, in this present moment. The past couldn't be rewritten. The years of separation couldn't be erased. But perhaps there was still time to create a different story moving forward, not one of perfect resolution, but of honest reckoning, not one of erased mistakes, but of genuine growth. And perhaps that was enough. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Brino's journey has touched your hearts. The path to healing is rarely straight, and true redemption requires more than words. It demands consistent action and genuine change. For more emotionally powerful stories that explore the complexities of family relationships, resilience, and second chances, we've created a special playlist that you can find by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring you unique narratives that examine life's most challenging moments and the courage it takes to face them. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. What resonated with you most about Ethan's story?